Hi, Dina. Thank you so much for doing this. Let me start asking you where you were born, where you are right now, and maybe some story that connects those two places.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to do this with you. Um, I was born outside of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, although my parents are Egyptian. They had immigrated to the United States in the early 70s, and I was born in a small town right outside of Philadelphia where I grew up. And then I moved back to Egypt when I was 14, and I spent most of my teenage years, my college years, my adult life building my career and living in the Middle East and Africa. And then I finally came full circle again and relocated back to the US in 2019 when I took a job at MIT. So I'm currently in Boston. And I say it's an interesting question because where I was born, which is the United States, um, to an extent has led to a lifelong crisis of identity between am I American or am I Egyptian, Arab, Muslim, African? And it took me so many years to realize that I'm all of that, which I think is what led me back to being okay with relocating and finding myself right back where I started here back in the United States. Only here, I'm very, at this stage in my life, extremely comfortable with the very complex nature of my identity.
Wow, that's so interesting. One of the books that I like the most is The Unbearable Lightness of the Being. And I read this book several times, and it's funny because every time I had a different read. And first time I read the book and I saw these four characters that are very strong characters, and I felt like you they represent people should fit in one of these characters, right? And it was like just on the third or read second or the third read that I understood that we have those four characters inside us, right? And they take turns. It's much more that they take turns than we are one or the other or even an average. No,
No,
it
different parts
takes
of us
turns.
come out at different times.
Yes. So it's very interesting that you say that you uh, came to terms with the fact that you are all of this, and with this complex personality. How do you see it? And having lived in, I wouldn't say extremes, but in these two different worlds, how do you see the world today? Do you think the world today is better, or is it worse than it was before? And is it getting better or is it getting worse?
Um, yeah, it's a it's an interesting question. I think a hard question, right? Because I think if you think about it, uh, in many ways, the world is in a better place, um, and technology has had massive impact in allowing us to make the world a better place. But in many ways, the world is a worse off place, right? If anything, the pandemic and the past year and a half has revealed to us um, just how dysfunctional some of our systems are and also how inequitable. So, even though we advance technologically and there are all these amazing innovations and technology, and this smartphone has enabled us to do so many things and to be connected in so many new and interesting ways, we have yet to really use technology to transform our systems in ways that work for everybody. Um, and one of the things that one of the reasons why I joined, I took this position at MIT, which is executive director of the Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship based at Sloan, is because the center was really created to think about how entrepreneurship and innovation can be a pathway to prosperity, but prosperity that doesn't leave anybody behind. And I think um, the question is, I think in some ways we're doing better, and in some ways we're doing worse. And I think for us to be doing better on the whole, we need to remember that we are all connected. And if something works for one but doesn't work for another, it really doesn't work. And I think what has also been revealed when you think about the pandemic, you realize that over time, in this kind of fast-paced world that we all live in, and this incredible need to achieve and build things and do things, we kind of also forgot that as humans, we're all connected, and community and the collective is extremely important. And when I think about the pandemic and those who have suffered as a result, you realize that it's also not just a factor of the dysfunctionality of our systems and how they're working, but it's also a factor of the fact that as a population and as people, we don't function as a collective anymore. We kind of think about ourselves. We've become very individualistic, and we need to go back to this place of thinking about each other and how our behavior influences each other, so that we can get to a better place that works for all of us and not just a few of us.
But I, uh, how can I say this? Is this a feeling, or which metrics you use to say this? I don't want to put you on the spot here, but let's take one thing that very positive that I think that happened with the pandemic. We developed the vaccine in record time.
We
No,
did,
so
but we couldn't
and
get the vaccine to those people who needed it in record time.
yes,
So
okay,
this is why I
this
say it's good. I think in terms of technology and science and innovation, we're I think it's oftentimes mind-blowing just um, how much of an opportunity we have, right? But when you think of the vaccine, yeah, in record time, we had vaccines and they were ready to go to market in what, in a year, in a little under a year, and it was a fabulous thing. But if you think about the ability of the global population to access that vaccine, no, it was not equitable, and we didn't really think of a way to distribute the vaccine globally in a way that was equitable and in a way that would allow us all as a global community to continue to thrive. And I think what happened is that those who could afford, countries that could afford the vaccine, were able to do that. And there are a lot of countries in the world who just couldn't. And I think what has happened is that there's just an unequal distribution of the vaccine. And that doesn't take away from the fact that the innovation is fascinating. I just think we haven't been able to or we haven't been able to solve for how we make innovation inclusive. And I think that is what would make that is what would say, for me, we're in an amazing space, because I think innovation for the sake of innovation doesn't work unless we're able to commercialize it in a way that is inclusive and equitable. So if I can sit in Boston and get the vaccine, but somebody I love in Cairo can't, that doesn't make me happy.
yes, I understand what you're saying. So if you think of the challenges ahead, this would be the most important challenge, or like, or do you see other? If I can, let's see if I understood. So you just said a very interesting, a very important sentence, like innovation cannot be for the sake of innovation. Innovation has also to be inclusive. So would you say that this is an important challenge ahead? We know how to innovate, we are even good at it, and it has reduced the human suffering, but it's still not inclusive, or it's not taught to be inclusive.
Yeah,
Or
I
is
think
it part of the innovation process where adoption is it's a curve, and it's not a linear curve, and we're also and how, and if I can go one step further, um, what is the role of funding on this inclusiveness? So
Well,
first,
let me
I
take
asked it a lot of questions. So
let
like,
me take
first the
I think I
challenge,
got it.
like if the challenge of inclusion
Yeah.
is the largest one, and then how can we try to tackle it?
Well, let me take a step backwards. Um, in innovation, when you think about what is innovation, right? We innovate to solve a problem, right? When we innovate, we're creating a new solution. And that solution is to solve a problem that needs to be fixed, right? So I think, I don't know if solving for inclusion is our biggest problem, or if solving for how we educate those who innovate is the bigger problem. And also how we incentivize, how we think about the role of innovation. So, and I think about this here when, at MIT, you have, or if we go back to the vaccine, right? The vaccine was created, that's the science part, right? And the innovation part was that this vaccine was created. Now, in order for that innovation, so say for the Moderna vaccine to actually make the world a better place, we had to commercialize it, right? So it needed to go to market. And the commercialization is where innovation meets the business world, and how you take an innovation and you commercialize it. Something in that puzzle is missing. So, how do we take an innovation, commercialize it, go to market, and really think when we commercialize something and take it to market, how are we ensuring that it's truly getting to everyone it needs to get to in a way that will really make the world a better place and that will solve the problem for everyone? So, in a way, I would say maybe solving for inclusion is a critical problem across the board and across all systems. Because if you think about the breakdown in any system, whether it be healthcare, whether it be education, it's oftentimes who is left out, who doesn't have access, who is it biased against. It's where innovation starts. It's where innovation starts lacking, right? So I think when we educate students or those who are innovating, and when the innovation meets the business side, how we can create business models that lead to prosperity for everyone, if that is the mindset, then you commercialize in a different way. You start thinking in a different way. And I think, and I see you like writing return on investment. When you think about it, if you're developing, if you're commercializing a product, and if you're trying to make your solution accessible to everyone, only you have to make it slightly more affordable in order to make it accessible to everyone. When you think about it, and we talk about this all the time when we think about the base of the pyramid, which is the majority of the global population, who we make an assumption can't pay. We think that the poor can't pay for basic products and services, but it's a myth, because what happens is the poor pay, and they often pay a premium because accessibility is a problem. So if we're thinking about making sure that we provide inclusive solutions, and we may have to, our price point may need to change. In the aggregate, I would say our return on investment would be much higher
Yeah,
because you're including everyone.
I put this question because I read in the beginning of the pandemic a very interesting article from MIT Tech Review, which was, the title was "Venture Capital is not funding the problems, like the solutions to the problems, that it's not funding the solutions that we need."
That's correct.
So the point of the article is, look, yes, VC is it's a risk investment, but the metrics are all return on the investment. Okay, so they are on the problems that have the potential to return on the investment. So there is, and like you said, the incentives. So the incentives are not uh, um, um, well distributed or well positioned, because how how are we going to fix this? Who is going to fund the solutions of the problems that we have? So
Well, let me put it in another way, right? So at the Legatum Center, we've been thinking a lot about risk capital and about venture capital. You know, we don't talk enough, we don't have enough conversations about how capital is deployed. And I think the role of investors, uh, or the role that investors can play in systems transformation is significant, but we don't talk to them about it, right? They are stuck. Investors are stuck in this kind of paradigm of money in, money out. Money in, how can we multiply that to get the highest return possible? And the same would go for the LPs who put money in these funds, right? Um, oh, when the pandemic first started, and you saw companies really struggling to survive, innovation driven companies struggling to survive, and struggling to survive also because they were burning cash, right? The kind of overall, I think, the norm for a lot of startups in the innovation space was to raise an enormous amount of capital, burn through cash, and it was okay because more cash would come. And I think a lot of people during the pandemic took a step back and were thinking, is this really the right way to go about um, funding innovation? And if we think about it, a lot of venture capitalists we were talking to were basically coming back and saying, well, we've been deploying capital into innovation, but yet here we are in the midst of a pandemic and our systems are failing. So, were we investing the right way to begin with? I think what has been happening is that we see venture capital, risk capital invest in businesses that bring the highest financial return back. But the reality is, if we invest in businesses that are solving real problems at a systemic level, it's almost impossible that it wouldn't have a high return because it's solving a real problem for people who need it to be solved. I think the issue is we don't have good conversations with those who deploy capital about systems change and about how they have a significant role to play in transforming systems by building a portfolio of companies that will lead to that system transformation. And if you think about how you build a portfolio of companies, and I say this, and I'm a venture capitalist, I have my own fund. I have a venture capital fund that invests in fintech. And I would say the same thing. We need to build a portfolio that is going to impact the overall system of financial inclusion. And if every business we invest in is somehow building upon the other, for sure we're going to get high returns because we'll be solving at a systemic level, which means that ideally it would work for everyone, which should bring us higher returns. But we don't see that as a way, it's not a paradigm, it's not a mindset. That doesn't mean we can't get to that mindset. We're just not having those significant conversations.
do you think the impact funds, this category, are what you are describing somehow is what is coming to my mind as the impact funds. But when I talk to the impact funds, I see difficulty to define what is impact, difficulty to define, and then we are coming back again and again to what is the cash flow, what is the valuation, what is the and it's so difficult. At least I can tell you from the perspective of someone in the developing country with the kind of funds that we have here. it's a very difficult conversation, and you don't see so many deals being done, so many capital flowing to these impact projects,
Mhm.
and
I, I
so
I don't really like to use the word impact just because it's so vague and broad, and it could be anything to anybody. When I think about it, I think about, is there a problem that is being solved? Is the problem relevant? And is it being solved in a way that can serve those who really need it? And then I think about the system. Is this venture truly going to have uh, going to transform a particular system, or solve a gap in the system, or completely disrupt the system? And I think moving from this kind of word of impact to a systems level thinking approach allows for a lot more creativity in how we think about our investments, because you can break down a system, and you can scientifically, you can, and you're a scientist and you know it, you can think, you can take a systems level approach, you can break it down, you can understand how the system functions, and you can think about, is this new innovation, how it's going to impact the system or not? And I think when you put it under that lens, we can start seeing real change, and we can measure that change. I think what's happened is this impact investment space has become a space where there's like a massive spectrum, which means it's become everything and nothing. And that's not really useful to anybody. What we really need to do is to get really serious about what are the problems within our systems, and the varying systems of education, of healthcare, of transportation, of energy, all of these varying different systems that impact everyone's life on a day to day basis. Where are these systems breaking down? And what are the problems that we need to solve for? And from there, start thinking about how those innovations can truly transform the system in a way that works for everyone.
but the way that you're saying, it seems to me like we need people to um, kind of change this mindset. And I particularly don't like a lot the idea that um, kind of people have to, like the sentence, the people have to understand that they have to do this because it's the common good. And I prefer what you said before about the incentives. So if there is, so maybe there's not enough incentive to solve the system level problems, right? And I was wondering
Well,
what
that's
could
because it
be
goes back
those
to the original.
incentives.
It goes back to the original point I made, right? Which is the the we need to move from thinking about what serves me as an individual to what serves the collective, including me as an individual. And I think that the somehow we've been living in a world that has been about, what is the maximum return I can get for myself, or what is the maximum return I can get for my shareholders, as opposed to what is the maximum return I can get for all of my stakeholders. And that requires a shift in mindset, and it also requires that policymakers and regulators incentivize business that is inclusive, right? That we find ways to somehow say we need to solutions that will be equitable, that will be accessible. Because I think the worst thing that we've seen with the rollout of the vaccine is the inequity of it, the inequity of the distribution. But I think also, even during the pandemic, the worst thing that we have seen is the inequity of who had access to good health care when they got sick.
Yes.
And that was a tragedy, right? Because it wasn't like I'm a multi-billionaire and so that will protect me against getting COVID versus somebody who is low income. Everyone was at risk of getting COVID, but it shouldn't have been that the person who is a blue collar worker, or who came from a rural underprivileged area, could not get access to adequate health care, but somebody who had wealth could.
Okay, but let me put an idea to see your opinion on it. Because being a biology scientist, I tend to look at nature and biology, let's say at, even at a very basic level, what biological algorithms, okay? And 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 I try to see that whenever we try to go against those algorithms that are millions of years of evolution, it's very hard. So if you try to tell your brain not to that has all these biological or chemical algorithms for short-term reward, like dopamine builds up, everything's very fast. Our brains were made to uh, um, worry about what we are going to eat next,
Instant
how to escape
gratification.
next.
Yes.
But this is, like, it's hardwired. We cannot change this. It hasn't been enough time to change the way our brain works. So so that's why I think it's difficult for just for education, for example, to change this biological instinct. It will be very hard for us to always, think on the long term. And so you need to be hardly incentivized to think long term, to act long term, and not to be selfish. I think it's the only way uh, um, of co-living with this brain of ours that is short term. And so going back to the incentives and the selfishness, and I would take again the example of the vaccine. I think what is beautiful in a vaccine is that when you take the vaccine, you are only should be, and I think people who doesn't think like this are wrong. You are only acting in your own self best interest. You take the vaccine because you don't want to die. The vaccine is going to prevent, in the case of, I don't know, measles or polio, it prevents you tuberculosis. It prevents you from getting this disease, from dying, prevents your children from getting and dying. And in the COVID, we are in the same thing. So it's a very selfish act.
I
It's,
don't
or
know.
at
I
least
don't know,
it's,
Mauro. I would slightly disagree with you. In the particular case of COVID and the vaccine for COVID, yeah, in many ways it is extremely individualistic, as in it's going to prevent you from dying. However, the vaccine also makes transmission of the virus much more difficult.
but that's the point. So what I'm saying to you is there are models in which when you are acting on your own self best interest, this is also on the best interest of the community.
Right.
Okay.
But if you think here in the United States, many people are not taking the vaccine, although they have access, because they're not thinking that by taking the vaccine, this is going to support the bigger community. So you're right to an extent, but I think you're spot on when you say that we are hardwired to think about instant gratification. But we're also missing the fact that until everyone gets vaccinated, we all continue to be at risk. And that the vaccine in the case of this pandemic is it's very important for stopping the rapid transmission of the virus and to reaching a level of global herd immunity that will stop the death that has been happening. I mean, you come from Brazil, I come from Egypt. We've seen an enormous amount of unnecessary death as a result of the virus. And that is a communal issue. So when somebody contracts the virus, it's always going to be a result of reckless behavior. Either somebody was being reckless or somebody around them was being reckless. And the vaccine is your protection against that reckless behavior, right? So I think it's a combination of what you're saying and what I'm saying. It is very much about individual survival, but in the case of a pandemic, it's also very much a case of collective
Look, I'm
survival.
not defending that we don't think of the community,
I
but
know.
what I'm arguing is that I don't want to count on it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I
so
get it. You're
and
probably
and
right.
and what are the incentives that I don't have to count on it? And I know that it can be done because nature does it all the time. There's a lot of I could don't want to bother you with the details, but there are some models that shows how species acting on their own best self-interest they contribute to the homeostasis of the environment, making a better environment for all the other species without having to count on them. And and I think that the in on like going against all of these are the business models. There are so many predatory business models, and what I want to ask you is uh, maybe we are too tolerant to all these. Um, okay, let me go back because my brain is going faster than my mouth. So if we think about all these incentives, they could be better distributed. But what we actually see are uh, very unequal incentives. So some people benefit too much from tax incentives, or like government money in one's, and then there are no incentives to share it back or to share to the other shareholder, share with other stakeholders, not just with the shareholders. So you have this system with where the incentives are not well positioned, and this leads to some predatory business models. And I've seen how predatory business models hurt some amazing technologies like GMOs, okay, that the world population has developed a prejudice against GMOs that is completely unfounded in scientific evidence, but it was probably connected to the business models of the companies that started producing and commercializing uh, um, the seeds and the plants that started the market of GMOs. But at the same time, we are very tolerant with the big tech predatory business models that preys on our attention, our time, and everything. And can we get out of these vicious cycles of business models and distribute better these incentives, or we probably can. So maybe the question is how long is going to take?
I don't know. I mean, it's the question that I think about every day. I think, so many of us, at the beginning of the pandemic thought, is this going to be an opportunity for everyone to take a step back and think about how we can function differently so that we don't see the businesses that you talk about continue to thrive, right? But now, as hopeful as I was at, at a certain point that people would take the moment to really rethink, as much as I'm not so sure that we're going down that path, because you see things pretty much going back to business as usual, as if we forgot about the year and a half of a pandemic and living through a very difficult time in our, at least in our modern history. I think that what will be required is very intentional interventions with, you're a biologist, so you're an ecosystems person. And for ecosystems to work well, the different components of the ecosystems need to be doing, like I relate to what you're saying. When everyone um, thinks about their own best interest, it will work for the collective. I would say that when you're thinking about an innovation driven ecosystem, when every stakeholder is doing what they're supposed to be doing, but uh, united around a common purpose, then I think uh, we might see a very different way of doing things. I think the problem is that there's a complete misalignment across stakeholders within innovation ecosystems, and we need to find a way to align everyone around a common purpose. And if that common purpose is about innovation that is inclusive and equitable and accessible, and that means that every stakeholder in the ecosystem needs to function accordingly, then we can start building the incentives that are required to allow this to happen. I don't have a clear answer for you. I wish I did. Maybe what you and I should do is to think about writing something that provides a framework for this, where you take your biologist's mind and combine it with the best of what MIT knows around how innovation ecosystems function, and how we can create incentives that would make it work better for everyone. I don't think we're
Let's
having
do
these
it.
conversations. So I think maybe your podcast is onto something for bringing these conversations forward.
But look, one aspect of what we are talking about is how uh, um, unnecessary risk is and fail. So how um, a an unnecessary bet that went bad is not punished and sometimes is even rewarded, right? So what we call crony capitalism, right? And how the bets that are made out of greed are not checked, right? Because
Yeah.
even in an ecosystem with all the resilience, if you over consume your resources, you are going to go extinct, and there's no one that can come and save you. You know, like if you don't have the necessary redundancy on your systems, and you are going to die, and there's no coming back from that. And I think that um, those predatory business models could not survive or exist in an environment that doesn't that punishes these bad investments or these
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. There needs to be consequences. And we don't have enough consequences. So, as much as we need to incentivize, we also need accountability.
yes. Good. Let's write this article.
Let's do it. I'm in.
Let's do it. So, Dina, before I let you go, let me ask you three short, rapid-fire questions. So, the first is, what book you are reading right now? And you already told me, so please don't. I want the truth.
Well, the truth is, I'm in my mid 40s, and I am sadly, or not, I don't know. I'm reading a book about menopause, and basically acquainting myself for what is to come. Um,
Okay.
and aside from that, I'm also reading a book called Transcendent Kingdom uh, by the author of another book I loved called Homegoing, which and her name is Ya Gyasi. So I do have one fiction and one, well, not pure fiction, but fiction
Well,
based
and
on real life, and one book about the future of my life.
Second question is, do you take long or short lunch breaks?
Always long. I'm Egyptian.
Wow, you're probably the first person on the podcast that to to give this answer. The third may be interesting for you. Bitcoin, are you a believer or a non-believer?
I think the short answer is I'm a believer. The longer answer is I'm a believer that has done nothing about my beliefs. But you're going to fix that, right?
I hope to. It's going to be my, so like the two things that we are going to do. We are going to write an article on, the metaphors of ecosystem and ecosystem innovation ecosystems and nature ecosystems, and hopefully I can help you getting acquainted
Yay, I can't
with the
wait.
Bitcoin world. One of the very interesting things of the blockchains, and I would say specifically the Bitcoin blockchain, is that incentives are very well distributed and there's no work around them. So if you screw up, there's no one to save you. The algorithm is going to execute whether it hurts you or not. So you should really know what are the incentives, because there's no one that can come and save you. It's beautifully uh, um, uh, distribute. It's a beautiful example of incentives distribution and a new technology that prevents um, individuals or individual groups to execute things on their own, to their own advantage. So the rules without rulers. It's beautiful. You're going to get in love with it.
You have to send me something to read. I find this fascinating, and we do have to write something.
Yes, I'm going to. So, like, one book that I loved reading about it is the Bitcoin Standard, and it starts with money, because you cannot. One very interesting quote that explanation about Bitcoin that I heard was, Bitcoin is everything you don't know about money with everything you don't know about computers. So it's a bit
Oh
hard,
my God, that is
but
probably very true.
I would even add that there is a lot that you don't know about physics, because the beauty of it is also that it's like it's thermodynamics money. But you need to know, and you probably already do more than I did when I started this journey 4 years ago, know about money. And then when you learn about economics and how money works, you realize we need a better one. And in my opinion, Bitcoin is. Gina, so
I'm in.
much. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you,
We have to
Mauro.
do it some other time. Actually, we have not to stop doing this. Let's keep
We'll do more.
talking and hopefully start working together.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Bye.